Did you know that the FBI has a world-class code-breaking team? Basically, their job is to decode any encrypted evidence. So imagine coming across a piece of evidence that appears to have secret messages embedded inside of it. It's the job of these brainiacs on the decoding team to go in there and figure out what those secret messages are. Now, this decoding team is incredibly good. But periodically, they do run into riddles, if you will, that are just way too difficult and they can't figure them out. And when this happens, they will often appeal to the public and say, hey, anyone out there, if you can solve this riddle, let us know. And so today's story will involve one of those types of impossible riddles. And if you stay till the end of the video, you'll actually see the mystifying evidence. And I'll show you where you need to go online to literally help the FBI solve this riddle. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, the next time the like button takes their full kitchen trash bag out to go out to the dumpster, immediately throw an open container of clam chowder into their empty can before they can come back and put a new bag in. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. At around 5 o'clock in the evening on June 25th, 1999, a man named Ricky McCormick stumbled into an emergency room in St. Louis, Missouri, with his hand over his chest, complaining that he couldn't breathe. He said he had asthma, and earlier that day he had been cutting the grass, and so maybe that had caused a flare-up. But either way, here he was in a lot of discomfort saying, I need help. Ricky was 41 years old, and for his whole life, he had had heart and lung problems, and so him arriving in this state in the ER was actually not all that uncommon for him. And so this hospital did what they did with anyone who came in complaining that they couldn't breathe. They immediately took Ricky to a back exam room and they hooked him up to all these monitors to make sure his heartbeat was steady and that his oxygen levels were plenty high. And once Ricky was in the exam room getting hooked up, he started acting really agitated and he kept looking around the room like he was scared that someone was going to jump out at him. And he was also sweating profusely, and whenever he did speak, he spoke so quickly no one could really understand him. But despite Ricky's odd behavior, the heart monitor showed his heart was beating steadily, his oxygen levels were perfectly fine, and when the doctor came in and examined Ricky, even though he clearly saw that something was off about Ricky, there wasn't any sign that there was anything physically wrong with Ricky. And so the doctor and the nurses agreed that whatever was going on with Ricky had to be psychological. And as it happened, Ricky did have a long history of psychological issues. He was known for making things up all the time, just telling people these crazy stories about himself, like how he was this talented singer and he was about to go on tour, or that he was actually a prince, or that he was studying to be a doctor. I mean, things that nobody thought was true, but Ricky would say as if this is just common knowledge, this is who I am. And so Ricky's family for the longest time had just assumed that Ricky was either bipolar or maybe schizophrenic. Those are both serious mental health disorders that totally disrupt normal thinking. But Ricky, despite being encouraged by his friends and family to go get help, never got help for any of his psychological issues. And so Ricky's life had kind of gone off the rails. He had dropped out of high school and not gone back to any sort of schooling, and he had spent some time in jail. Now, Ricky was living in a low-income, very dangerous part of St. Louis, which is a big Midwestern city on the Mississippi River that in 1999 had a very serious issue with gang violence. Ricky absolutely hated it there, but he had no way to actually leave St. Louis. In fact, Ricky didn't even have his own place. He bounced around from his mother's place, his aunt's place, and his girlfriend's place. Ricky did work, but the work was very sporadic, and it was for the most part just night shifts for random odd jobs. And when Ricky was actually working, he really just spent his time chain smoking cigarettes and drinking literally gallons of coffee. Back at the ER, Ricky, who was still in the exam room, had only been there for less than an hour when the doctor came back in and told Ricky that he was okay and he was going to be discharged. Now, Ricky immediately said, no, I have to be here tonight. I need to stay here. You need to admit me. but the doctor just kind of ignored what he said and handed him the discharge paperwork. 15 minutes later, when a nurse came back into the exam room to get this paperwork from Ricky, she would walk in and see Ricky still sitting on the exam bed, kind of fidgeting around, looking down at this paperwork on his lap that immediately she saw he had not filled out. He had just signed his name at the bottom. And when she walked in, Ricky looked up at her and he kind of shrugged his shoulders and looked at her and was like, "I don't know how to read or write. Can you help me?" And so the nurse immediately felt bad for Ricky. I mean, he's got dirty clothes on, he looks thin and frail, he's clearly very down on his luck, there's some issues happening with this guy, and he can't even fill out his discharge paperwork. And so she said, no problem. She sat down with him, and together they filled out his paperwork. And then afterwards, when she walked him out of the exam room back to the front of the hospital, Ricky turned to her and said, instead of going home, can you just let me stay here in the lobby just for tonight? And this nurse, who knew she was not allowed to do this, she looked around and saw it was not a busy night there. And so she said, okay, as long as you don't bother anyone, you can stay here. And so Ricky thanked her repeatedly and then walked over to the corner, kind of far away from the front desk and far away from the front door. And he sat down and folded his arms, and then he just stared at the front door. And so this nurse assumed that Ricky actually must be homeless, especially based on, how he came in and how he was acting. And so she figured, he needs a place that's warm to stay tonight. And so the nurse went back to her station, and over the course of the next several hours, she would periodically look out into the lobby, expecting to see Ricky kind of curled up asleep in the corner. But every time she looked out there, Ricky was still sitting upright, arms folded, staring at the front door of the hospital as if he was expecting someone to come in at any moment and he needed to be ready. And so she thought this was unusual, but she decided not to intervene. She just let him sit there and do his thing. Later that morning at 11:30 a.m., when the nice nurse who had allowed Ricky to stay in the lobby was leaving her shift, another crew of nurses came in, and right away they noticed Ricky was just sitting in the corner for no apparent reason. And when they walked up to him to ask if he was okay, what are you doing here? What can we do for you? Ricky, instead of trying to talk to any of these nurses, just got up and walked out of the hospital. After leaving the hospital, Ricky walked to a nearby payphone and he called his girlfriend, Sandy. And when Sandy picked up the phone, she immediately recognized her boyfriend's very familiar voice, but she also picked up that he sounded really tired and kind of out of it. And so when she asked him, are you okay? What's going on? Ricky would tell her that he had just spent the night in the hospital. But he didn't clarify that he had spent the night in the lobby of the hospital, not admitted as a patient at the hospital. But to Sandy, it really didn't matter because already this was raising red flags for her, because this was actually the second time that Ricky had gone to the ER just that week. Just a few days earlier, Ricky had been released from a different hospital in St. Louis after telling doctors there that he had had these chest pains and he couldn't breathe. And so he had been admitted for a couple of days, but ultimately they determined that there really was nothing wrong with him. And they too believed whatever was happening with him had to be psychological. And so he had been released. Additionally, Sandy had been growing increasingly worried about Ricky because over the last several weeks, Ricky had begun acting really paranoid, to the point where anytime he was in her apartment and somebody outside the apartment just walked down the hallway, Ricky would jump as if he was worried whoever was out there was going to barge in at any moment. But whenever Sandy asked Ricky, what's going on? Why are you so paranoid? He refused to elaborate. So, feeling very concerned about Ricky, on this phone call, Sandy would say to Ricky, please come to my apartment and let me take care of you. If you're not feeling well, I'll make you feel better. Just please come to my apartment right now. But Ricky said no, he did not want to go to Sandy's apartment. He told her instead he was going to walk to a nearby gas station to get a bite to eat, and then afterwards he would give Sandy a call. And so the two of them agreed to this plan. They hung up. But then Ricky did not call Sandy later. A worker at the gas station where Ricky said he was going would later tell authorities that Ricky did come into the gas station and he got a hot dog on that day, the 26th. And then the next day, this same worker said, yep, we saw Ricky again on the 27th. He came in here, he got a bite to eat, and then he left. But after that, nobody saw Ricky, not his aunt, not his mom, not his girlfriend. He didn't show up in any other emergency rooms in Missouri. He just disappeared. On June 30th, so 3 days after Ricky was last seen at this gas station, a woman was driving her car 20 miles north of St. Louis on this highway when she looked out into this cornfield that butted up against the highway, and she saw kind of in the middle of it was this dark shape that looked totally out of place. And so she was intrigued enough that she actually pulled over on the road, she got out, and began walking into this cornfield to see what this thing was. And when she got up to this thing and saw what it was, she froze in horror, and then she screamed, turned around, and ran back to her car, and she flew to the nearest gas station, she grabbed a payphone, and she called 911. When the police arrived at this cornfield, they too walked out towards this dark thing, and then finally they saw what this thing was that had scared this woman. It was a dead person who was lying face down. Their body was very badly decomposed. And in fact, their body was just kind of falling apart. Like the fingers of this person's body had just kind of crumpled off of their hands. Now, based on what this person was wearing, they appeared to be male, but there was no way to tell how this person died or really how long they had been dead for. But despite the advanced decomposition, authorities were able to get a good fingerprint, and it would turn out that this body belonged to Ricky McCormick. The day after Ricky's body was found, the police would come out and say they were treating his death as a homicide. This area along this highway in this cornfield was actually a fairly common place for murderers to dump their victims. And it was very unlikely that Ricky had gotten there by himself. He didn't have a car. In fact, he didn't even have a driver's license. There was no public transportation that could have brought him to this spot. And if Ricky had decided to walk to this area for some reason, it was a solid 15 miles from where he lived and worked. Also, Ricky's body was way too decomposed relative to when he had last been seen alive, just 3 days earlier. And so there was a theory that perhaps he was killed somewhere else and then kept indoors in heat, and that had accelerated his decomposition, and then at some point whoever had killed him had moved his body and dumped it in this cornfield. And so on that first day of the homicide investigation, July 1st, the police put 18 detectives, so a ton of detectives, on this case, and they also appealed to the public to come forward if you had any information about what could have happened to Ricky McCormick. But just a day later, on July 2nd, the police came out and made an announcement that, after looking at all the evidence and looking at Ricky's body again, it did not appear, in fact, that he had been murdered, but instead he must have died of natural causes. This is a guy that had lung and heart problems, and so that is likely what killed him. Case closed. And so after this announcement, all of the evidence in Ricky's case was bundled up, put into storage, and people just kind of forgot about it. 6 months later, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, got a tip that involved Ricky McCormick. They were working on a case in St. Louis, Missouri about this major drug dealer who apparently was ordering hits on his rivals, and a confidential informant came forward and told the FBI that this guy, Ricky McCormick, had gotten wrapped up with this major drug dealer. But they didn't really know what role Ricky was playing with this drug dealer. It was just kind of a rumor on the street that, Ricky was involved somehow. This did not make any sense to the FBI because they're thinking, why would this big-time drug dealer who really was a mover and shaker in St. Louis get involved with this guy, Ricky McCormick, who was obviously deeply mentally ill and borderline homeless? I mean, what role could Ricky play for this drug dealer? But the FBI still did follow up on this tip because it was very credible, and when they spoke to the local police who had investigated Ricky's death, they got Ricky's file, which meant they got all of the evidence, and immediately the FBI realized the local police had overlooked a very strange piece of evidence found in Ricky's pocket. This strange evidence was quickly sent to FBI headquarters in Quantico, Virginia, and it landed on the desk of a forensic analyst named Dan Olson. Dan was relatively new to the FBI, but he was highly disciplined and very methodical. And so when he received this piece of evidence, he got to work right away trying to figure out what it was, what it meant in relationship to Ricky and this drug dealer, and maybe does it answer the question of how these people are connected. But despite his best efforts in calling in the experts and using every computer program to analyze this evidence, he just could not figure out what it meant. At the same time that Dan was doing this, the big drug dealer who was the target of that big FBI investigation in St. Louis was arrested on gun and drug charges, and so the big case was now over. And suddenly, trying to figure out what connection Ricky McCormick had to this drug dealer was kind of irrelevant, because the drug dealer was behind bars and Ricky was already dead. And so the FBI kind of put a pause on trying to figure out what this evidence was. And so Dan, even though he was really curious now, he was fully invested in trying to figure out what this thing was, he realized he had to give it up too and move on to something else. And so the strange evidence went back into storage, and once again, everyone just kind of moved on from Ricky McCormick. But Dan never really forgot about this mystifying piece of evidence. It was always in the back of his mind. 22 years later, Dan Olson had now become very senior at the FBI. He was actually in charge of their cryptanalysis and racketeering unit. Basically, he was in charge of the people at the FBI who specialized in code breaking, meaning they were the people that would pull any sort of secret messages embedded inside of evidence. And so at some point after taking over this unit, Dan pulled out of storage this strange piece of evidence connected to Ricky McCormick, and he said, you know what? I just need to know what this means. I have to figure it out. I've never been able to. It's haunted me ever since. And so Dan went public. He went to the media and he asked the world to take a look at this mystifying piece of evidence and come forward if you have any idea what it means. When Ricky was discovered in that cornfield, the local police quickly emptied his pockets. And in his pants pocket were 2 documents that contained an incredibly complex cipher or code. It was basically 30 lines on each piece of paper with different symbols and letters and capital letters. I mean, it looked like total gibberish to the untrained eye. But to people like Dan and his code-breaking team, these symbols and letters could mean there was a secret message hidden inside of these documents if you could break the code system. But of course, no one could ever break that code. So how in the world does a guy like Ricky, who is basically functionally illiterate and can only write his name, he's clearly mentally ill and he's not really in touch with reality all the time, how does a guy like that come to be in possession of these complex ciphers? And if he didn't write these ciphers, because that's possible, maybe somebody else gave them to Ricky, well, why would anyone who came up with this very complex cipher entrust a guy like Ricky to be the one to carry these things around? I mean, presumably, they contain confidential information that's been very carefully hidden inside of the cipher. And so why give it to Ricky? He's such a liability. And also, what happened to Ricky in that cornfield? I mean, we don't even know how he got there. We don't know how he was killed. All we know is that he had these ciphers in his pocket when he was found. And so many people believe, including law enforcement, that the answer to, what happened to Ricky and what was his connection to this drug lord in St. Louis, if any, or, what was he up to, will all be solved if we can just figure out what these 2 ciphers mean. But as of right now, no one has solved the riddle of what these 2 ciphers mean. All we know is that Ricky McCormick, a couple of weeks before he died, became increasingly paranoid and was so scared of someone or something that he was likely running into these hospitals just to hide out. But eventually, whoever or whatever Ricky was scared of very likely caught up to him and killed him. But until we crack these ciphers, we very likely will have no idea what actually happened to Ricky McCormick. Today, the FBI has set up a special website where you can look at these 2 ciphers that Ricky had in his pocket, and if you're able to crack them, because someone's going to eventually, you can tell the FBI through this website and potentially help solve Ricky's murder. To go to this FBI website, click the link in the description below. So that's going to do it. If you enjoyed today's story and you want to hear more stories like it, be sure to check out our podcast called the Mrballen Podcast, which has hundreds more stories, many of which are exclusive to the podcast. So if you want to listen to those stories, again, it's called the Mrballen Podcast, and it's available exclusively on Amazon Music. Today, I'm going to tell you two wild stories. The first story is about a little-known invasion of a South American country in 1949 that had absolutely insane unintended consequences. And the second story is about this very strange ritual that typically did not have horrible consequences. But one time, in 1851, it did. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times a week. So, if that's of interest to you, please offer to take the like button on a nice whale watching cruise. But once you're out in the middle of the ocean, just throw them overboard and leave. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. On February 12, 1949, a man in his 30s named Leonardo Paez paced around a radio station in a city called Quito, which is the capital city of Ecuador. It was a Saturday night, and Leonardo and all the people around him were working very hard to get ready for an urgent broadcast. So Leonardo was the director of Radio Quito, which was a highly respected news station owned by a popular newspaper called El Comercio. Most people in Ecuador basically got all their news either from this news station or that newspaper, or both. And running a radio station with such a great reputation was really a source of pride for Leonardo, who had grown up in Quito. So he took his job very seriously, which was why tonight was such a big deal for him. He was about to deliver a potentially life-changing broadcast to the entire city. And just thinking about the gravity of this moment was making him feel sick and sweaty. In the room with Leonardo was a team of producers and sound technicians, as well as one of the station's top news anchors. Most of the last-minute work they were all doing involved organizing stacks of paper that contained instructions about what to say and what to do during this pivotal broadcast. That's what the anchor was double-checking right now. He was the one who had written the broadcast script, and he would be the one actually reading it on the air. Leonardo looked anxiously over at the clock on the wall. It was already a few minutes after 9 p.m., and they didn't have a lot of time left. But even though Leonardo desperately wanted to get this broadcast started as soon as possible, he knew he had to give his anchor the space and time to make sure they were 100% ready before they actually went on the air, because they really only had one chance to do this right. So instead of telling the anchor to come on, hurry it up, Leonardo instead bit his lip and just paced around the station, trying to distract himself by listening to the program that was currently being broadcast over the radio station's airwaves. It was a live musical performance from a duo of singers named Benitez and Valencia. These two combined were really famous, sort of like the Taylor Swift of 1940s Ecuador. And so when people in Quito knew these particular singers were performing on the radio, basically everybody stopped what they were doing and tuned in to listen. So in Quito in the 1940s, nobody had TV, and so radios were like the ultimate form of not just how to get your news, but also of entertainment. It's really where everybody turned. But radios were also very expensive and were sort of a luxury item, so not everybody had one. The people who did have radios would often bring theirs outside to the street so that other people could also hear the programs and the music. And Leonardo knew that all of this meant that at this very moment, all across the city, most of Quito's 250,000 residents were gathered around a radio. And he needed to get his broadcast on the air while he still had everybody's attention. He turned and saw the anchor finally lean back in his chair, indicating he was ready, and so Leonardo knew it was time to go live. Leonardo turned and nodded to his technicians, who were all sitting at a table covered in broadcasting equipment, and one of them, after seeing Leonardo's cue, leaned forward to adjust several knobs and then hit a button on the control panel. And the instant he did this, the voices of the singing duo cut off, and a large red sign that said "On Air" lit up on the wall right above the table. Basically, they were going to cut off the performance to do this broadcast and catch everybody in Quito off guard. And then the anchor leaned into their microphone and, in a very urgent voice, said that they were interrupting this musical program because there was an alarming event happening that everybody in Quito had to hear about. Then he explained the reason for this broadcast. Ecuador was being invaded. About half a mile away from the radio station, 17-year-old Jose Antonio stood outside a restaurant with some of his friends. Jose and his friends and all the diners, plus a bunch of people out on the sidewalk, had been gathered around the restaurant owner's radio, listening to Benitez and Valencia sing, when suddenly the music had cut out and the anchor had come on to say that their country was under attack. And so as Jose and this group is sort of caught off guard and listening to this sudden announcement, the announcer got really emphatic and said, "Listen, the city of Latacunga has been destroyed." And at that, Jose's mouth fell open and he felt this jolt of fear in his chest. Latacunga was only about 60 miles south of Quito. So Jose, along with everybody else around him, instinctively leaned into the radio so they could hear more about what was happening and why. But when they all did that, the broadcast suddenly stopped just as abruptly as it had come on, and the music program came back on. But the street got really quiet as Jose and the crowd just kind of stood there, waiting for something to happen. I mean, really nobody knew how to react to this. A few people began looking up at the sky, thinking maybe warplanes might be flying overhead, and actually Jose began doing that too, wondering if, that's the next step. But there were no planes, and there were no signs of, anything that would indicate that war was happening nearby, or, whatever destroyed Latacunga was approaching Quito. All Jose could hear was the echo of other radios around the city, now back to playing this musical program. But as the seconds ticked by and the crowd gradually began talking again and kind of going back to normal, some people began making jokes and suggesting that this broadcast was literally a joke, that was meant to be a prank. Others just kind of brushed the whole thing off and just went about their evening as if it had never even happened. However, Jose did notice that some of the people at the tables outside the restaurant where he was were still just kind of staring at the radio and shifting around like they were restless or uncomfortable, like clearly that broadcast had struck a nerve. Jose also kept fidgeting around and trading worried looks with his friends and the other people around him because he wasn't so sure this was a joke. And the reason he wasn't sure was because a sudden invasion of their country had actually happened before. 7 years earlier, in 1941, when Jose was just a kid, the much larger country of Peru had invaded Ecuador after an argument over land along a shared border. Instead of settling the argument diplomatically, the Peruvian army stormed into the disputed territory in Ecuador and conquered it pretty easily. And the fighting had only lasted for maybe about a month before Ecuador accepted that they had lost and retreated, giving up the land. But even though the fighting back then had never actually reached Quito, it had been a terrifying experience for residents of Quito because it made them realize they were not able to defend themselves against a foreign invader. But just then, as Jose and the others are sitting outside the restaurant kind of grappling with what could be going on here, how real is this, is this a prank? Just then, the music that had come back on again on the radio cut out, and once again, the broadcaster's voice came on, and they said they had an update. The enemy had landed their aircraft right on the outskirts of Quito in a northern area called Cotocollao, which was only 8 miles from the center of Quito. And suddenly Jose and the others realized that if the enemy had destroyed Latacunga in the south and now landed in Cotocollao in the north, then the city of Quito was effectively surrounded. But before Jose could even process this thought, another man's voice came on the radio. And unlike the first voice, which was emphatic but, basically calm, this guy was absolutely panicked. He said he was the chief of Quito's newspaper, and then he basically screamed, "The airbase has been taken over by the enemy and destroyed. They're exterminating everything and everyone." He continued to yell that the enemy was using poisonous gas and they were using fire and they were literally killing people and destroying homes and buildings. And then he issued a simple and terrifying warning. They're coming. Jose felt himself let out this yelp that he couldn't even control. He was so suddenly terrified. But he didn't even hear it because all around him,
Everybody else seemed to react basically the same way all at once, and the streets erupted in screaming and praying and just absolute chaos. Some people began pointing up to the sky, yelling that they could see the enemy. More and more people suddenly began flooding out onto the streets, crowding around the radios, trying to hear more information. They're all terrified and they don't know what's going on. Jose wanted to begin to tell these new people who were coming outside sort of what he and others had heard so far, but everybody out on the street was sort of talking over each other. It was just complete madness. And then literally on the radio, there's all these different voices coming over because clearly the news station is panicked and they can't even get a cohesive message out over this broadcast. However, despite this madness, the one word that kept coming through on the radio that everybody heard was "go hide. Hide from the enemy. Hide." And Jose and some other people around him were thinking about doing just that when finally a new voice took over the broadcast. And this man was louder and more authoritative than the others, and it sort of immediately projected calm, not just clearly calm on the other end on the broadcast side, but it sort of quelled the crowd for a second. This person sounded like an authority figure, and this person introduced himself as the mayor of Quito. And he said that yes, there are cities around Quito that are currently under attack, but he said he had clear direction that he wanted everybody in Quito to follow. But despite this instruction really being the first kind of clear next steps for people to follow, it didn't make Jose feel any better about this, because the mayor told the people of Quito that the women and children, they had to flee, go hide, go away, go find somewhere safe. But the men had to stay and fight. Jose felt this rush of adrenaline because he's thinking, am I old enough to be considered, one of the men? Will I be expected to fight, or are they going to tell me to go flee with the women and kids? Like, he didn't really know, but he had this calming thought. He's like, you know what? We're at war and I am going to fight. So he signaled to his friends, sort of saying, all right, let's go, let's get ready here. And the group came together and they left the restaurant. And at that exact same second, a car came flying past on the street, narrowly missing Jose and his friends. And Jose saw it screech around the corner and out of sight before he heard this loud bang and the crunch of metal against stone. Immediately, some men ran after this car because clearly it had gotten into an accident and they need to go if they need help. But other people started running in the opposite direction. And so for Jose and his friends, it's like, what do we do? Do we go help with the car crash, or do we go, head to the front lines or something? At the same time, women were running by, clutching children, and Jose saw a pregnant woman stumble on past, grimacing as she held her stomach. Screams were echoing from all around him, along with the rapid pounding of boots on cobblestones as people basically ran in every direction. Jose was still trying to figure out which way he should go and what he and his friends should actually do here when he heard a news speaker's voice come on the radio, who announced himself as the Minister of Government, which was basically like the person who controls the security of the entire country of Ecuador. And the Minister of Government said to forget about what the mayor had told them about fighting the enemy, because Ecuador's weapons were literally not powerful enough. There was nothing that anyone in Ecuador could do. This is what the minister said. He basically said, we're going to lose. Just then, another new voice came on the radio. It was this very fast-talking man who said he was actually reporting live on the ground in Quito. Then he screamed out over the broadcast for everyone to run. And then his feed abruptly cut out. And then the original announcer came back on, and his voice shook as he said that reporter who had just said for everybody to run had just been killed. It was 9:21 p.m. 21 minutes had elapsed since this broadcast first went over the air, announcing this invasion of Ecuador. And in that time, it was like the country had spiraled into absolute madness. Now, remember, at this point, Jose is gathered with his friends. He's sort of begun to leave the restaurant, but so many things have happened all around him that he and his friends are just kind of standing there near the restaurant, not really sure what to do. And as they're standing there, Jose noticed that all these people who previously had just remained seated or remained near radios, it was like everybody all at once just got up and began running in different directions, running to the churches, running to their homes. It was like the entire country truly was just in full-blown panic mode. Jose also began to notice families come running out of their homes, dragging suitcases and belongings with them, getting ready to, evacuate hopefully, but where could they even go? They're surrounded. And just then, Jose heard the sound of glass shattering, and he saw a few people over at the restaurant's bar taking liquor from the shelves and pouring themselves drinks before tossing the bottles on the floor. Jose looked and realized his friends had already left him, so he's just standing here all alone. And he knew by this point he can't just keep standing here thinking about what he's going to do. He needs to do something. He needs to act. But just then, the radio crackled back to life, and once again there was a voice calling out one final update. But it was so crazy all around him, Jose couldn't understand what this final update actually was. He just didn't hear it. However, Jose could clearly see other people around him had heard this final update, and they were obviously reacting to it because they stopped. Everybody stopped running around. They put down their suitcases, and everyone just kind of stood there. And then people began going for their guns and knives and torches. And then, once this huge, now armed crowd came together, they began to move as one, all in the direction of the city center. In the city center, in the Radio Quito station, Leonardo watched as the anchor delivered that final update, the one that Jose had not heard but others had and clearly reacted to. A minute later, Leonardo heard glass shattering somewhere one floor below him, along with a loud crackling sound. Then he smelled smoke, and he noticed the air in front of him inside the studio was getting hazy. And then from outside the building, he heard somebody yelling, "Fire!" Behind Leonardo, the anchor grabbed the microphone and pleaded on air to anybody who was listening that the radio station was in trouble and to please come help. But there really was no one left to help them. They were on their own. And when Leonardo and his team realized this, they knew they had to get out of this station by themselves. And so they ran together down the stairs to the exit. But before they even got to the bottom of the steps, the smoke from the fire became so thick they couldn't even breathe. Leonardo realized that the whole first floor must be engulfed in flames. And so the only way out was actually to go up, not down. So Leonardo led the group back up the way they came, running back through the second floor office building, the studio space, where they had recorded the broadcast, and headed up the stairs to the very top floor. And by the time Leonardo got to the top floor, he could hear screams coming from somewhere below him, and they sounded painful and horrible. He hoped his coworkers had been able to follow him up here, but by this point there was so much smoke in the building, he really couldn't see, so he didn't know who was here with him and who had been left behind. And also the roar of the fire was getting louder by the minute, and it was so hot that sweat poured from Leonardo's face and it stung his eyes. And so Leonardo instinctively ran away from the smoke towards the windows, and because they're on the top floor, 3 floors up, looking out, he had a good view of the ground below. And he saw these huge crowds of people on the street. Most of them were holding torches and seemed to be running around in random patterns while big military tanks rolled in behind them, along with this hazy mist from some kind of gas kind of flowing across the entire crowd. Just then, Leonardo felt the floor under his feet begin to shake, and he frantically began to think, how am I going to get out of here? I need to escape. And that's when he saw the roof next door. So the radio station sat next door to a school, which was at this point not yet on fire. Now, the school building was not connected to the radio station, but it was close enough that Leonardo realized that he might be able to open up a window that he's standing right near, get a running start, and literally jump out the window and land on the school roof. Now, obviously, if he undershot this jump, he would fall to the street below and die, but the alternative was stay here and be burned alive. So Leonardo just opened up the window, he backed up, took a deep breath, got a running start, and jumped out the window. He flew into the air, arms flailing as he willed himself to land on the school roof, and after a millisecond in the air, he comes crashing down, slams onto the school building. He had made it. It was painful, but he had escaped. But Leonardo didn't have time to waste here, nor did he really have time to wait to see if others would also make this jump. He really felt like he's sort of on his own here. And so up he got, and despite the pain from impacting the roof, he was basically okay. And he walked across the school building until he went to the next roof. Basically, the next building butted up against the school building. So he climbs onto that roof, and he walks across that roof until he reaches the next building. Again, these buildings are all connected, so there's no more jumping from, one building to the next, but he is going roof to roof, basically high up above the streets of Quito. And down below, he sees, all this madness with the tanks and all these people with torches. He doesn't really know what's going on here. And eventually he reaches a roof, as he makes his way, that a family was sitting on. And the family, they were looking out at the city, where the sky was still glowing from the light of the fire Leonardo had just escaped from. And when they saw Leonardo, they told him they had actually been down on the streets in that crowd. But when it became too dangerous, they had come up here to escape. And they asked Leonardo, had he done the same thing? Is that why he was here? Leonardo said no. And then he told them who he was and how he actually arrived here and why, and then he asked them for help. And for a second, the family just stared at him in shock. But then they began to talk to each other, and from what Leonardo could hear, and also based on facial expressions, the family seemed mad. But finally, the father looked at Leonardo and said yes, they would help him. However, there was a condition. He told Leonardo that under no circumstances could he, Leonardo, go down on the street with that crowd. The father said Leonardo would have to hide out in this family's house because, the father explained, that everybody in the city, including all those people down there, wanted Leonardo's head. It would turn out Leonardo's broadcast had actually been wildly successful. It had done exactly what he hoped it would do. It grabbed the attention of basically everybody in Quito. The whole city stopped in its tracks to listen to what the broadcast had to say. However, there was one very important fact that Leonardo had decided not to mention in this broadcast until the very end, when in many ways it was already too late. This fact was the final update, the one Jose had not been able to hear, but that had caused everybody on the street who had heard it to stop running around, stop screaming, and just get their guns, knives, and torches and head towards the center of town. The fact that was held off until the very end was this whole broadcast was a farce. The invasion was not real. It was an act, a prank, a joke. The broadcast was like this play. It was an adaptation of a fiction novel called War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells, which is about an alien invasion. And so what Leonardo did is he orchestrated this broadcast to sound and feel like a real breaking news broadcast about an alien invasion. The exact same thing had actually been done in the United States a few years earlier in 1938. But in the American version, the listeners had been warned at the beginning of the broadcast that it was not real. And it still caused mass panic, even though they had been warned. And so, during Leonardo's broadcast, when he finally revealed the truth at the very end, the listeners were not, soothed. They were not like, oh boy, what a great prank. They were furious. So furious, in fact, that they went to the radio station in the city center where Leonardo and his broadcast crew were, and they lit it on fire. And so between the radio station fire and also between all the people who took their own lives preemptively, believing aliens were going to be here any minute to kill them, torture them, abduct them, the death toll from this night, from this farce, was between 6 and 20 people. And a whole lot more people were also injured in the chaos. As for 17-year-old Jose Antonio, he would survive, and later in life, he would actually give a tell-all interview about his experience during the so-called alien invasion. As for Leonardo, he didn't face any criminal charges, no jail time, nothing. But this whole incident really destroyed his credibility, and it made people not trust him in Ecuador. So it was basically impossible to get work. And so eventually he had to move to Venezuela. And then as for Radio Quito, the at one point very influential, very important news broadcast, they wouldn't make another broadcast for 2 whole years after this incident. On the evening of Sunday, January 26, 1851, a 23-year-old man named Bailey Staples hurried up the walkway of a home in Fall River, Massachusetts. It was so cold that Bailey's could see his breath. But despite the weather, he could not stop smiling. And that was because he was about to do something that he loved to do that made him a lot of money, and it was actually the 3rd time that day that he was even doing it. I mean, this was awesome. Bailey's was a psychic medium, and he was about to perform a seance. So at this point in America, in 1851, there was this phenomenon going on called the spiritualist movement. Basically, huge numbers of people began to believe that the living and the dead could actually communicate with each other through mediums like Baileys. And at this time, there was a very specific way that mediums like Baileys conducted their seances. They would sit at a round table along with all their guests that were going to participate, and they would summon spirits. And what would happen is the participants in these seances could literally tell when it was that the spirit actually made contact with the medium. Because the round table they were all sitting at would shake or move, sometimes the table would thump so violently that one of the legs of the table would break off. And a broken table at a seance was considered a huge success. So seances were a craze all over the country, and many people did genuinely believe that, people like Baileys, mediums, could talk to ghosts in these seances. But there were lots of people also who didn't believe any of it, thought it was completely made up, but they would still hire people like Baileys to have these seances at parties and other functions as sort of a form of entertainment, kind of like how you might hire a band or a magician. And in Fall River, Massachusetts, there really was a big appetite for these seances, both, because people believed they were true and lots of people who thought they were fake. And it's in part because there were lots of homes in Fall River, Massachusetts at the time that sort of had some history about being haunted, and so there was sort of groundwork laid for both believers and non-believers to contract people like Baileys. Now, to be clear, Baileys' whole seance act was a blatant fake. In fact, many of the people who hired Baileys knew in advance that it was all an act, that Baileys really was more of a performer than a psychic medium. But Baileys was really good at faking it, and so he had become kind of like the go-to medium, certainly in Fall River, which meant for him to maintain this flow of business, he really had to put full energy into every performance to keep getting people to call on him. So on this day, as Baileys is sitting there getting ready to start his third seance of the day, he was tired. I mean, it's pretty exhausting to do these performances, but he knew he just had to get that second wind and just push through and do as good of a job as he possibly could. And so as the homeowner of this third seance opened up the door and let him inside, Baileys was sure this was going to be at least as good, if not better, than the other performances of the day. Moments later, the homeowner, John Gardner, led Baileys into the living room where several other guests were already gathered. Baileys immediately snapped into character. He swooshed his cape as he walked in, and he waved his hand around the room to command their attention. And when everyone turned to look at him, he said, "I have broken 2 tables today, and now I've come to break yours." The guests all cheered and clapped, and Baileys could tell they were going to be a very enthusiastic audience, which always made these seances much more fun. So into the parlor they all went, and they all took a seat around this big circular table in the middle of the room. And then Baileys dimmed the lights and walked around the table giving his instructions. He then told them to all hover their hands over the table with their palms down and their fingers spread, and that each of them would have to touch the hands of the person sitting next to them. He told them that once they were all touching, it would create a circuit that was more inviting to the spirits. And so once all of his guests got into position with their hands, Baileys took his seat and did the same thing with his own hands, creating a full circuit all the way around the table. And at that point, everybody was ready. And so he nodded, and in a commanding voice, he said that now he was going to speak to the spirits. And if the spirits in the room felt like answering, they would move this table. The room got deadly quiet as everyone waited to see what Baileys would do. But Baileys just let the tension grow, because he knew that the longer he waited, the more anticipation would build. This was actually Baileys' favorite part of the performance, and he could feel his own heart begin to race. I mean, this really was exciting. But then finally, he broke the silence and called out to the spirits in the room and demanded that if there were a ghost here, to make itself known. And at this, everyone immediately began to look around excitedly, which created the quick distraction that Baileys actually needed to perform his first trick. So mediums used a few different tools to help them fake communication from these ghosts, and one of those tools were these special hooks that they actually attached to their wrists, and they hid them under their sleeves. And then when they put their hands palm down, hovering over the table like they told everybody else to do, those hooks would actually go below the table and grip on, so the medium could, without looking like they're actually touching the table, literally lift the table up and rattle it around, again, without appearing to actually touch it. Now, it actually took a lot of strength to do this. I mean, imagine moving a huge table around just like with your arms kind of hovering over the table. But Bailey's was getting really good at it. And so as his guests were all looking around, looking out for ghosts, Bailey's masterfully hooked his hooks right under the table and began moving his wrists around, which caused the table to thump. And as soon as this happened, a woman on the other side of the table screamed, and the other guests began laughing and getting really excited. But Bailey's was only just getting started. He called out to the spirit again, much more forcefully this time. And as he did, he literally made the table rise off the floor as all the guests gasped. One man asked how Bailey's was even doing this. I mean, he knew this was fake, but how are you lifting the table up? Because his hands are over the table, remember. It's just these secret hooks underneath. But Bailey's just kind of ignored the man and smiled. And then he said to the spirit that if you're willing to communicate with us, rap on this table one time. And then Bailey's used the hook, underneath the table to make a knocking sound. And as he did this, the woman who had first screamed on the other side of the table, she jumped. She was so scared. And it actually caused Bailey's to have this surge of adrenaline, he was really doing a good job. And so Bailey's actually kind of leaned into this and rattled the table a bit more for dramatic effect. And in doing this, Bailey's was really exerting himself. He's trying not to give off the vibe that he's moving this table around, but he really is. And so he's sweating bullets, and he's also yelling out to the spirit, demanding them to come forward and talk to us. But then, as Bailey's is doing this big act here that he in no way suspects is going to actually call spirits into the room, he suddenly felt the room turn icy cold. And he had this weird tingling sensation flowing through him. He blinked and then his vision got hazy. This had never happened to him during any of his seances. And clearly it was having an effect on him because he no longer was trying to communicate with the dead. He was just kind of standing there, very uneasy, like the seance was actually doing something, that there really might be spirits in the room. Now, Bailey's can tell he's getting stared at, and he doesn't want to destroy his business here. He needs to maintain the act. He can't just spook himself out and stop the seance. But at the same time, he couldn't break out of this weird feeling he had. The room felt so cold. Something was off here. And then he tried to move, and it was he couldn't. He was frozen. Now, at the same time Bailey's is experiencing this, across the table, the homeowner and host, John Gardner, is just sitting there staring at Bailey's, trying to figure out what's actually happening here. And from his perspective, he watched as Bailey's went from sort of standing there awkwardly, unable to move, it looked like, to then sitting down in his chair and sort of lurching back in this awkward position. And then Bailey's eyes began darting all over the room, and also his breathing got really ragged and heavy. And John couldn't help but feel it looks like Bailey's is possessed, for real. And then Bailey's began to speak, and his voice sort of cracked as he did, and he began mumbling something that John and the others couldn't understand. John, he really couldn't help it. He felt sort of spooked by this. This was really convincing. John actually wanted to applaud. Bailey's acting was so good here. But he also didn't want to destroy the act and sort of break his character. Like Bailey's, John and most of his guests did not believe seances were real at all. But, Bailey's performance was really turning out to be way better than any of them had expected. But just then, Bailey's shot up out of his chair, and the whole table thumped again and shook, and then Bailey's let out this almost ghostly-sounding moan, and then one of John's guests asked if the ghost was speaking through Bailey's. But instead of answering, Bailey's eyes rolled all the way back in his head, so only the whites were visible. John and the others were transfixed. This was just incredible, really kind of scary stuff here. But then Bailey's let out another moan and then fell backwards hard onto the ground. And for a second, there was just confused silence. Because if this is an act, that was a violent fall. This looks really legitimate. How is Bailey's able to do this over and over again? This seems real. And it was in that moment of realizing that something is off here that some of the guests began to scream and they began to run out of the room. A few minutes later, a local physician named Dr. Hopper ran into the parlor of John Gardner's home. He'd been summoned by one of the guests who had panicked and actually ran out and gotten him. But that guest had been rambling about a ghost and a possession, so Dr. Hopper really wasn't sure what kind of problem he was actually responding to. But now he could see there was a group of people dressed for a party gathered around what appeared to be a seance table pointing to the floor, where there was this young man lying in a crumpled heap. Dr. Harper went to the young man and reached out and felt the man's neck, but there was no pulse. And so the doctor turned and looked at the group and said, "He's dead." And before the group could really even react, the doctor said, "Now hold on, someone needs to slowly and clearly explain what happened here." John Gardner stepped forward and now in a very shaking voice explained that this young man was a medium whose name was Bailey Staples. And he had been doing a seance, and he had demanded a ghost talk to the group. And then a moment later, he was thrashing around, apparently possessed by this ghost, and then he fell to the ground, dead. John said they had all thought this seance was a fake. I mean, when they hired Bailey's, they literally thought this was just going to be a performance, nothing real. But now, I mean, they didn't know what to think. This looked very real. Dr. Hopper shook his head, not really sure what to make of this explanation. He certainly did not believe in ghosts. But after a quick examination of Bailey's, he really couldn't see any obvious cause for the medium's death. So Dr. Hopper got to his feet and told the dinner guests that, whatever killed Bailey Staples was not a ghost, but he didn't know what it was yet. However, he would get to the bottom of it. However, by the next morning, news of Bailey's death had spread all over Fall River and beyond, and it made the immediate autopsy that Dr. Hopper wanted to do to figure out what happened to him basically impossible. Now, the reason it was impossible is because some people were claiming that this was a ghost that possessed Bailey's, but it didn't actually kill him. The ghost must have put Bailey's into a trance where he appears dead, but is not actually dead. But if Dr. Hopper performs the autopsy on him, the autopsy will kill Bailey's, so you can't do that. And so pretty quickly, you have all these people that are showing up at Dr. Hopper's clinic and the local police station demanding authorities give them Bailey's body to prevent the doctor from killing him by doing an autopsy on him. And so it's this whole scene. And at the same time, keep in mind, the country as a whole has been taken with seances. That was already something that was sort of happening everywhere. But this story, which sort of legitimized the idea that ghosts could be real and ghosts can also be dangerous given what happened to Bailey's, this story is spreading like wildfire all over the country. And so at a time where people in America were already big on seances, this pretty much dumped gasoline on that. And seances became even more popular, but now because they felt real, not because they were entertainment. On January 28th, so 2 days after Bailey's was pronounced dead, Dr. Hopper stood in the basement of the local morgue holding a scalpel. He had finally gotten the approval to go ahead and conduct his autopsy, but he knew that a lot of people were not happy about it. And now he was looking down at Bailey's body, realizing that, to his own surprise, he was sort of nervous about this. Like the idea that, what if this guy's actually still alive and I'm about to kill him with this autopsy? Now, logically, the doctor did not think Bailey's was in a trance, but it was unsettling how physically healthy Bailey's body looked. He was young and strong with no history of illness, and there wasn't a mark on his body anywhere to explain why he was dead. The only blemishes on his skin were these slight bruises around his wrists, which Dr. Hopper understood were from the special hooks he had been wearing when he died to lift up the table. But Dr. Hopper shook off the nerves and moved his scalpel towards the skin of Bailey's chest and made his first incision, opening up the chest cavity. And that was when Dr. Hopper saw it. It would turn out, on the day Bailey Staples died, he was at his absolute performative peak as he lifted John Gardner's table up off the ground and made the seance guests scream and laugh. But what Bailey's didn't know, and what Dr. Hopper found when he performed the autopsy, was that Bailey's had a pre-existing heart condition, and his passionate performance, coupled with the physical exertion it took to lift up that heavy parlor table with just his wrists, and the fact that Bailey's had also already given 2 other similar performances that day, caused his weak heart to swell and develop an aneurysm which ruptured and caused fatal internal bleeding. Bailey Staples had basically put on the absolute best seance performance of his life. It was so good, in fact, that it killed him, and also accidentally convinced an entire house full of dinner guests and many people all across the country that ghosts were real. Thank you so much for watching today's episode. Let me know what you thought of it in the comments below. And remember, we have a whole playlist of Places You Can't Go episodes ready for you to binge right now. So go ahead and click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Today, we're going to look at 3 places you can't go and people who went there anyways. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please gift the like button a brand new puzzle, but don't tell them you've secretly removed 2 of the pieces. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. Just before midnight on August 20th, 2012, a 19-year-old college student named Rose Marr and her best friend, 19-year-old Elizabeth Nass, walked down Main Street in their hometown of Ellicott City, Maryland. It was their last night together before they each would head back to college in separate states. And so to cap off what had felt like a perfect summer, they decided to grab a few beers, despite being underage, and head on over to their favorite hangout spot, a train trestle that ran over Main Street. A train trestle is literally a bridge, but for trains. Now, to be clear, this train trestle was not like some secret daredevil hideout spot. Lots of people knew about it. Lots of kids in town, including Rose and Elizabeth, had been up here many, many times. And while there was an active train track that ran across it, the ledge on the trestle where everybody would sit when they were up there was several feet away from the tracks, kind of safely out of the way. You could be up there looking down over the town, and a train could literally pass right by you and not affect you. So overall, it was safe. So Elizabeth and Rose climbed up onto the train trestle and took their seats along the ledge, safely away from the tracks. And then they cracked open a few beers and began talking about their upcoming semesters. They talked about which classes they were going to take and what they were looking forward to and really how much they were going to miss each other. And then at some point, Rose pulled out her phone and she took a photo of her and Elizabeth's feet dangling off the trestle. Basically, the photo captured their feet kind of hovering over Main Street. Then she posted that photo to Twitter, and then as soon as she hit post, she and Elizabeth heard this loud screeching sound coming from right behind them. And when they turned around to see what it was, something huge smashed into them, and then it went black. That loud screeching sound was the sound of a train passing by right behind them. But remember, the tracks are set far enough back that, the train, it couldn't hit them. And in this case, the train was not the thing that hit these 2 girls. Instead, it was something truly unfortunate that happened to them. When that train passed by the girls, it partially derailed. Not a full scale, like cars going everywhere off the tracks, but instead, several of these cars basically toppled over to their sides. And some of those cars that toppled over were carrying thousands of pounds of coal. And these were open cars. You can literally see the coal as the train goes by. And so as the train's going by, those cars topple, all this coal comes out, and the coal smashed into Rose and Elizabeth and fully buried them. It was like they were under an avalanche, but not of snow, of coal. And so by the time the girls were pulled out of the coal, they were already dead. Rose and Elizabeth were the only 2 fatalities from this derailment. Their families would later sue the railroad company alleging negligence, and each family would receive a settlement, though the exact amounts were never disclosed. Thank you to BetterHelp for sponsoring today's video. June is Men's Mental Health Awareness Month, and so in honor of that, I wanted to share a quick story about my own mental health. So back in 2017, I got out of the military after several years, and I really went through a sort of identity crisis. So much of who I was wrapped up in being a Navy SEAL, but now that I was out on the other side, it was like I didn't know who I was anymore, and I didn't even know what job to get or really what to do with my life. And it was sort of like this existential crisis that really sent me into a very dark and depressing spiral. But instead of seeking help or telling anybody about it, I began sort of lashing out at family and friends and just kind of being a downer everywhere I went. It wasn't until my family and friends, because they loved me, stepped in and said, "You really need to see someone," that I finally understood the impact I was having on other people and how bad things had gotten for me. And so I did go out and I spoke to a therapist. And at first, I admit, I wasn't sold that this was going to be a big solution for me.
But pretty quickly, having that neutral third party to kind of bounce ideas off of and gain perspective from really changed my life, and it set me on a course to where I'm happy today. I still see a therapist, but it's therapy that got me to this place right now, this equilibrium I have reached. It's because of therapy. So if you're struggling right now, I would highly suggest thinking about therapy as an option. And a great starting point for therapy is BetterHelp. Primarily because it's entirely online. So it's very easy, it's accessible. All you have to do is fill out a quick survey online, and then within 2 days, they'll pair you up with a licensed therapist. And if for any reason you want to change your therapist, you can do that at any time at no additional cost. Click the link in the description below, or go to betterhelp.com/Mrballen to get 10% off your first month of therapy. Again, that's betterhelp.com/Mrballen to get 10% off your first month of therapy. Okay, back to the stories. At 6 p.m. on October 27th, 2014, a 17-year-old boy named Jesus Meneses was playing basketball with a group of friends on an outdoor basketball court at Kinlock Park in Miami, Florida. The friends had broken up into 2 teams and were in the middle of a very intense pickup game. And the game was pretty close, and Jesus' team was doing pretty well. But at some point, when Jesus and his team had possession, one of his teammates just got frazzled by the defense and just took this crazy 3-point shot from way behind the line, and the ball just sailed right past the hoop, completely missed it, air ball, and it bounced and then went clean over this chain link fence on the edge of the park. And as soon as this happened, Jesus and all of his friends let out a collective groan, because they knew basically anything that went over that fence was pretty much gone forever. But to Jesus' surprise, one of his friends turned to Jesus and was like, "Hey, why don't you just hop the fence and go get the ball?" Now, Jesus really did not want to do that. I mean, he had been coming to this park since he was like 1 year old with his family, and his mom and dad had always told him to never, ever climb that fence. Never. But now, Jesus' friend who had asked him to do this had kind of like turned it into a dare, and he's like, "No, really, come on, Jesus, like, go hop the fence and get the ball." And the other friends had kind of picked up on this, and they were kind of egging it on, being like, "Yeah, Jesus, go over there, get the ball." And so Jesus knew, like, this is not a good idea. I cannot go over that fence. But here I am, surrounded by all my peers, basically egging me on to go do it, and he didn't want to look weak or scared, and so he's thinking to himself, hey, what's the worst that could happen? And he's like, all right, I'll go get it. And so Jesus left the basketball court and walked over to this fence. And it was about 7 feet tall, and there was all this barbed wire across the top of it. And so as he's standing there looking at the fence, he turns back around, and his friends are all smiling like, "Yeah, go get it." And so he's like, okay. And he begins climbing the fence. And he gets to the top, and he reaches the barbed wire, and he very carefully positions himself so he doesn't cut himself on the way over. And right after he's cleared the barbed wire, he kind of tumbles to the other side of the fence. He hits the ground, and he's kind of shaken up from hitting the ground pretty hard. But, he stands up, dusts himself off. He realizes he's okay, and he turns and looks through the fence now at his friends, and they're all cheering him on. And so now Jesus is feeling really confident, and he kind of smiles at his friends like he's the hero now. And he turns, and sure enough, there's the basketball just a few feet away. So he walks over, picks up the basketball, and chucks it over the fence back to his friends. And Jesus was about to climb over the fence and go rejoin his friends when he happened to look back in the direction of where his basketball had been, and he noticed there was another basketball that somebody else had lost over this fence. Except this basketball was on the other side of a second fence. Basically, once you climb this first fence, a couple of feet later, there is a second fence. These were the 2 fences that Jesus and everybody who ever came to this park were warned about. Never climb them. But Jesus has already climbed the first one, and he's got his basketball, and he's thinking, I can climb the second one too, and I can get that basketball, and then we'll have 2. So if we ever lose another one, we have a backup. So without even telling his friends, Jesus walks over to the second fence, which is basically identical to the first fence, about 7 feet tall, a bunch of barbed wire at the top, and he carefully climbs to the top, and he kind of positions himself over the barbed wire, and then he drops down to the other side, except this time, when he hits the ground after clearing that second fence, something horrible happens. Within seconds of Jesus landing inside of that second fenced-in area, his friends back on the court saw what was going on and began totally panicking. They're screaming, they're running around, they don't know what to do.
Eventually, one of them would call 911, and then minutes later, first responders show up and they find Jesus' friends. They're totally frantic. They're all pointing toward the fenced-in areas. And the first responders, they look and they know right away there's virtually nothing they can do to save Jesus. The reason these fences were totally off limits, the reason Jesus' family specifically warned him from when he was a young kid to never ever climb them, was because inside of the second fenced-in area was an electrical power grid. And there were signs all over these two fences warning people to stay back, that it was dangerous, no trespassing, like fatalities will occur if you go in here. But Jesus ignored the warnings, and he climbed the first fence, and he climbed the second fence. Except when he landed inside of that second fenced-in area, he landed on a live electrical wire. And the second he did, 500,000 volts of electricity coursed through his body. For reference, the average lightning bolt contains about 300,000 volts of electricity. So as soon as Jesus hit that wire, it was like the equivalent of 2 lightning bolts striking him at once, but not just one time, over and over and over again. And so unfortunately, Jesus died almost immediately. On the afternoon of April 22nd, 2023, a 49-year-old father of 3 named Carl O'Keefe crawled through a cave system in Cumbria, England. He was on his hands and knees shuffling his way forward, and the only light that guided him through this tight, small tunnel was the headlamp on his head. So Carl was an adventurer. He loved things like rock climbing and exploring caves, but this particular cave he wasn't that familiar with. He'd only been here a couple other times, and he didn't have a map, so really he didn't actually know where he was going. But Carl wasn't remotely worried, because he knew this was easily the safest cave system he had ever explored. In fact, this place was so safe that often people showed up with their kids and let them run around freely with no fear they were going to get hurt. And so Carl has no worries here. And also he's thinking to himself, he's not very far into this particular tunnel. He can actually still hear the other people and their kids kind of right behind him. And so again, even though he doesn't really know where he is, he feels completely fine. And so Carl continued crawling through this tunnel, and eventually he reached this T intersection where he just had to choose between going right and left. And again, he's got no map. He doesn't really know where he's going. So he decides, okay, I'll just go right. And so he begins going down this tunnel, which closely resembled the tunnel he had just came from. But as he was crawling along, he started to feel like the walls around him were kind of shrinking, and it was getting harder and harder to push his body through this tunnel. And then finally, when it felt like it was so tight around him and it was getting so claustrophobic that maybe he should just turn around, he reached a dead end. That's all this was. The right turn was just a dead end. And so he thought, okay, I'll just turn around and go back the way I came and, maybe explore the left side. So in order to do that, Carl decided he would make a U-turn with his body. He would literally just turn around and go back the way he came, leading with his head and his upper body. And so he's facing the dead end. He's on his hands and knees, and he begins doing this U-turn. And he kind of turns and gets his head and his shoulders and his upper half kind of folded around until they're looking back in the direction he was coming. But he was too physically big to get his lower half to complete the U-turn. And so he was effectively wedged in this U-shaped position. He couldn't do anything. He was just stuck. But Carl didn't panic, because he knows this is a safe place. This is not a big deal. Nobody gets hurt in these cave systems, and I just need to rethink how I go back the way I came. Clearly, this U-turn attempt is not working. And so he decides, okay, let's reset. I'll pull my shoulders and my upper body back, and I'll reset facing the dead end. I'll basically go back to exactly the position I was just in. Except when he tried pulling his upper body and his head and his shoulders back to where he was facing the dead end, he realized he was also stuck going in that direction. He couldn't go back to the way he was, and he couldn't return in the direction he had come. He was stuck in this U-shape and couldn't go anywhere. Now, again, Carl is telling himself that it's gonna be okay. This is a safe place. Kids play here. Like, this is no big deal. I'm gonna be okay. And so he tried, to kind of shimmy himself one way or the other, but it was like no matter what he did, he just could not move out of this U-shape. And as that happened, he began to kind of panic. His heart rate began to rise. It became harder to breathe. It felt like the walls of this cave were kind of pushing down on him. And before long, he was becoming overwhelmingly claustrophobic. It just felt like the walls of this tunnel were were crushing him, and he really began to panic, and he just started screaming out for help. Immediately, some of the staff who heard Carl yelling out made their way into this tunnel system and actually saw Carl. They could see him in this U-shape, totally wedged. And at first they couldn't understand what was even happening here, but when they tried to pull him out, they couldn't get him to move. I mean, he really was totally stuck here. And so sensing that this was a true emergency, the staff backed out and they called the fire department. And the fire department, they came out and they too could not get Carl out. He was stuck. And so pretty quickly, Carl realized all he could do here was just do his best to stay calm, because this position he was in was really restricting his breathing, not to mention, the tunnel itself is pressing down on him. And so he just tried to stay calm and kind of have measured breaths. And he kept thinking, the rescue team, they're right there. They're gonna get me out of here quickly. I know it. But much to Carl's shock and to the shock of all the first responders, they didn't get Carl out quickly. Instead, it would take an agonizing 4 hours to finally free him. And during those 4 hours, Carl got weaker and weaker and weaker and more panicked. The instant Carl was out of the tunnel, he was rushed to the nearest hospital and admitted to the intensive care unit. And there, they would discover he had suffered all these extensive crush injuries from being in that position for so long. He had severe bone damage, organ damage, and nerve damage. I mean, he was in horrible shape. And despite heroic efforts by medical staff to try to save Carl, ultimately, he would die 8 days later.
Today's story was all over the news a couple of years ago, but there was a mind-blowing detail about this story that very few news outlets chose to report. And so today's story will end with that detail. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2 or 3 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please ask the like button to hold your very easily startled cat, and then once they do, press the test button on your smoke detector. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's story. On April 17th, 2018, 42-year-old Holly Mackey sat down in aisle seat 14C on a Southwest Airlines plane. That morning, she, along with 143 other passengers and the 5 crew members, would be flying from New York City to Dallas, Texas. And then after that 4-hour flight, Holly would get off that plane and board another plane from Dallas to Oklahoma City, where she lived. But luckily, that flight was only about an hour long. After Holly buckled her lap belt, she put her carry-on bag under the seat in front of her, and then she waited to see who was going to be sitting in the 2 seats to her left. A few seconds later, a 43-year-old bank executive and mother of 2 named Jennifer Reardon came walking down the aisle and stopped right outside of row 14 and turned into the aisle towards Holly. And Holly, who was kind of keeping her head down, she noticed there was this person standing outside of her aisle, and so she turned and looked up, and looking down at her was this big bright smile, and Jennifer said to her, "Hey, can I sit next to you? Is anybody using those seats?" And Holly would say, "Nope, I'm here by myself, go right ahead." Unlike other airlines that would assign seats to all of their passengers before they boarded, Southwest Airlines has an open seating plan. What they do is they basically group passengers into boarding groups, but then once that group is on the plane, it's first come, first serve. After Jennifer slid past Holly and made her way to the window seat where she sat down, which was seat 14A, she buckled her lap belt, and then just like Holly, she took her carry-on bag and stuffed it under the seat in front of her, and then she pulled a paperback book out of her bag and started reading it. For the next few minutes, as more and more passengers came onto the plane, nobody took the seat between Holly and Jennifer, because generally speaking, people don't like riding in the middle seat if there is a window or aisle seat available, because it's just not very comfortable sitting between 2 people for hours at a time. But eventually, the only seats left were middle seats. And at some point, this preteen girl who had her head buried in her phone, she comes onto the plane and she works her way down and she stops outside of row 14 and she very politely politely asks Holly if she can sit between her and Jennifer. And Holly says, absolutely. And so this girl slips past Holly and she sits down in seat 14B. She puts her lap belt on, she takes her carry-on, puts it under the seat in front of her, and then she just goes back to looking at her phone. Now that all of Holly's seatmates had arrived and she would not need to be getting out of the way for more people to come into a row, Holly kind of relaxed for a minute and she pulled out her iPad and she began scanning through the news as she waited for the plane to finish boarding. After all the passengers had been seated, one of the flight attendants closed the airplane door, and then they grabbed the microphone and welcomed everyone aboard the plane and thanked them for choosing Southwest Airlines. And then they reminded everyone on board to make sure their seatbelt was fastened, that their tray was in the upright position, that their seat was upright as well, that they'd stowed big electronics. And then with the help of several other flight attendants, they went over some basic safety procedures in case of a mid-air emergency. Most of the passengers on this flight were really not paying attention to the safety brief. They were trying to sleep, or they were stowing their stuff, or they were sending one last text message. But Holly, on the other hand, she was paying careful attention. Now, this wasn't totally unusual for her. She was generally safety conscious, but for some reason on this flight, she just had a sense that something bad was about to happen. There was this deep sense of foreboding that she normally didn't feel on flights. And so she found herself really carefully paying attention to these procedures in case something did go wrong. After the brief was over, the attendant who was holding the microphone thanked everyone for listening and then said, sit back, relax, and enjoy your flight. But Holly couldn't do that. Because one, she really did have this weird sense that something was off about this flight, that something bad was going to happen, and she just didn't know why. And then number two, she remembered that she had drank this huge cup of iced coffee before she boarded the plane, and so now she really had to use the bathroom. But the plane had already begun taxiing over to the runway, and an attendant had told her she had to sit down. You can't go to the bathroom now. You gotta wait until we're up in the air. And so Holly, who was now feeling very mentally and physically uncomfortable, found herself kind of anxiously looking to her left out the window as the plane continued to taxi to the top of the runway. And then once the plane was set, it paused for a second, and then the engines fired, and Holly and the girl next to her and Jennifer all got sucked back into their seat as the plane began hurtling down the track. And so Holly, the girl, and Jennifer, they're all turned, they're looking out the window as the plane is just bombing straight ahead. They're watching the airport kind of disappear out of view, and then they feel the plane begin to get lift, and then they take off. As the plane rapidly ascended, Holly turned away from the window and just sat back and closed her eyes and was just picturing that moment when they reached their cruising altitude, and she would hear that chime in the cabin, and then the captain would come on the intercom and say, we've reached our cruising altitude, it's now safe to get up and walk around, at which point Holly was going to run to the bathroom. And so when the plane finally got to a point where Holly felt like they were starting to level out, they probably were going to be at their cruising altitude soon, Holly preemptively undid her seatbelt and turned to face the aisle, getting ready for that chime in the cabin so she could get to the bathroom as soon as possible. But that chime didn't happen. Instead, when they reached their cruising altitude, the captain came on the intercom and she would tell everyone that they had reached their cruising altitude, but no one can leave their seats yet. They were expecting some fairly rough air, some turbulence. And so Holly was totally frustrated and disappointed, and she let out this audible grunt out of frustration. And Jennifer, who had her head in her book, she hears this grunt and she turns to look at Holly to make sure she's okay. And at the exact same time, Holly found herself kind of looking down and turning towards the window to look out the window, and she made eye contact with Jennifer. And immediately Holly recognized that Jennifer thought something was wrong with her, and she was kind of looking at her to make sure she was okay. And Holly just goes, I really have to go to the bathroom. And so at this, the two women kind of laughed about Holly's plight because it was kind of funny that she desperately needed to go but wasn't allowed to. And so eventually Jennifer just said, I'm sure they'll let you go soon. And then Jennifer went back to her book, and Holly went back to anxiously waiting to use the bathroom. And the girl sitting between them did not care at all. She was not listening to them. She didn't care. She had her head buried in her phone. After several minutes, Holly started to worry that it might be a while before she was allowed to get up and move around, because she's looking at the flight attendants and they're all buckled into their jump seats and they were hitting some turbulence. And so Holly's thinking, okay, I got to do something to take my mind off of this discomfort. Not only the physical discomfort of needing to use the bathroom, but also that strange foreboding. It just was not going away. And she didn't know what it was, but she just had the sense that something bad was going to happen. And so Holly decided she would do some work. And so at 11:04 a.m. Eastern, she reached down below the seat in front of her and began fishing around in her bag for her laptop. Before she could grab it, she heard two deafeningly loud sounds in rapid succession. The first was a popping sound that came from outside of the plane near the left wing, and the left wing was right outside of their window. And then she heard this whooshing sound that went through the entire cabin. It was like a high-powered vacuum. And then the entire cabin became freezing cold as the plane banked hard to the left. After all this happened, in this fraction of a second, Holly sat up, and it was like she was immediately in shock. She's looking out across the other seats, and she sees all those oxygen masks have deployed from the ceiling. People are screaming, the attendants are running up and down the aisle trying to help people put their masks on as the plane is hard banking to the left, and Holly just kind of robotically reaches out and grabs the mask right in front of her, and she tries to put it on, but despite having listened intently to the safety brief, it was like her hands didn't work, and she couldn't get the band to extend long enough to put it over her head. And so she's fumbling with this mask, still in shock. She can't believe this is actually happening. This is how she's gonna die. And then it's like she snaps out of it, and she forgets about the mask, and she turns left to make sure the girl and Jennifer were okay. And what she saw was absolutely horrifying. That popping sound she heard outside of the plane was the sound of the engine underneath the left wing exploding. And when it detonated, the cowling, which is the outside of the engine, it kind of protects the engine, it broke apart. And one of the pieces of this cowling flew and hit the side of the aircraft, and it struck the window of row 14, Holly's row. And when it did that, it shattered the window completely, causing an explosive decompression of the cabin. When even a small hole opens up in a plane flying miles above the earth, that hole will create hurricane-like forces inside of the cabin, and so anything that is not completely anchored down, including people, will get sucked out of that hole. And in this case, that's what happened. When that window broke open, Jennifer, who was sitting closest to it, was immediately sucked through the window. Now, she was not completely ejected because her seatbelt kept her from going completely out the window, but her entire upper half was now wedged outside of the plane. As for the girl sitting next to Jennifer, in between Jennifer and Holly, she was still getting pulled towards the window because Jennifer, even though she had been pulled out, there was still segments of the window that were open. And so there was still suction towards the window. And so Holly instinctively reached over and grabbed this girl and pulled her in tight to her chest. And then with her left arm, she reached behind the girl and grabbed the belt of Jennifer. And she tried to pull Jennifer back into the plane, but she could tell there was no way she could pull her back. The forces pulling Jennifer out of the plane were far too strong. Holly remembers thinking, someone is going to know this is happening. There's got to be a sensor or something. The flight crew has got to be aware that a person is getting pulled out of the plane. But in reality, the captain and the flight crew, they were aware that the left engine had blown up. That was the thing they were actively trying to combat, to try to keep the plane from crashing. But they had no idea about the drama that was unfolding in row 14. And so Holly is holding on to Jennifer, she's holding on to this girl, and she's screaming out for anybody in the plane to please take notice of the fact that Jennifer is stuck out of the plane. But the sound that was being created by this open window was deafening. Nobody could hear anybody else in this plane. Not to mention, the plane is banking hard to the left, and everybody on board believes they're about to die. So no one is looking around, taking stock of what's going on and assessing what to do next. Everybody's in survival mode and is basically just focused on themselves. And so despite Holly yelling out and trying to wave to people, it was worthless. Jennifer was just stuck out the window and no help was coming. And so for several minutes, Holly is just holding on to Jennifer. She's holding on to this girl. She's screaming out for help, but no one's hearing her. And then eventually, as the plane began to come back from its bank, and it seemed like the pilot was taking control of the craft, even though it was deafening inside and it was still terrifying, people began to open up their blinders a little bit and they started to look around, and some people sitting in the vicinity of row 14, they noticed what was going on with Jennifer and they began yelling and waving for the flight attendants. But again, the sound from this window was deafening. There was just no way the attendants could hear them. And even though everyone's waving at the attendants are very preoccupied. They're dealing with the people right in front of them who are all very worried and concerned. They're trying to talk to the captain about what they need to do next. And so they did not see there was this emergency happening. And so for several more minutes, Jennifer is just stuck out the window with nobody helping her. And it was during this time, as Holly is holding on to her waist and she's holding on to the girl, that Holly is thinking, Jennifer, she's been stuck outside the plane where there's no oxygen for almost 10 minutes. Nobody can survive that. And Jennifer has been forced through this window that's not big enough to have a person fit through it. And so Holly found herself moving her left hand that was gripping onto Jennifer's waist. She just let go of it, not because she was trying to let go of Jennifer. Frankly, her hand was not keeping Jennifer from going anywhere. It was just kind of habitual that she was holding on to her waist. So she takes her hand off of her waist and she just places it right in the center of Jennifer's back. Like she was comforting Jennifer. She was showing Jennifer that you're not alone. We can't help you, but you're not alone. And the woman in row 15, an older woman, she saw Holly do this and she reached across and she put her hand on Holly's back. It was like everybody knew this is a total crisis, but there's just nothing we can do, even if it's killing Jennifer. Despite the damage to the left engine from it exploding, the captain, Tammy Jo Schultz, who was a longtime veteran of the airline, she was able to combat this hard bank to the left and she regained control of the plane, at which point, through the intercom, she was able to bark out orders that were loud enough for the flight attendants to actually hear what was going on, and they were instructed to get up and walk down the aisles and make sure the passengers are okay. And this is when the crew spotted Jennifer. They acted quickly and rushed over and they grabbed Holly and the girl next to her and they safely got them out of that row and moved them to a different row. And then once they were gone, two men named Andrew and Tim, they volunteered to go in row 14 and pull Jennifer back into the plane. They knew the risks. They pull her in, there is still an opening in this plane, and they could very easily just get sucked out themselves. But they didn't care. They knew they needed to help this woman. And so without any hesitation, the two men walked into row 14, they got in position, and with all their might, they were able to pull Jennifer in, they got her into the aisle, and then the two men were able to leave row 14 without being sucked out. And so Jennifer is laying in the aisle, and a passenger who happened to be a nurse, who was named Peggy, she rushed over and she began performing CPR. At this point, Holly remembers looking around the cabin and seeing that everybody was just perfectly still. It was still deafeningly loud inside of the cabin because this window is still sucking air out. So it's very, very loud, but she's looking out and there was just this aura of calm inside the plane. No one was running around. No one was panicking. Everyone was just kind of sitting, watching as Peggy was trying to save Jennifer's life. At 11:21 a.m., so 17 minutes after that pop was heard outside of the plane, the captain of this plane is able to successfully perform an emergency landing at an airport in Philadelphia. And as soon as they touched down on the runway, the captain had already coordinated with a medical team who was standing by, and they rushed on, they grabbed Jennifer, they rushed her out, they got her to the hospital, but unfortunately she didn't make it. She died from blunt force trauma from having been forced out of that window. It was just too small and it happened too suddenly and it killed her. Holly was obviously very shaken up by this experience, just like the rest of the passengers who were on board. But there's a detail in Holly's story that makes her experience even more traumatic. On the morning she got on this plane, she arrived at the airport fairly early, she had a big coffee with her, and she got in line for security. So as she's going through this line, she's drinking this huge coffee, and then when it's her turn to actually go through the scanners, she finishes this coffee, she throws it away, she goes through security, and by the time she's on the other side, she's now late. And so she runs all the way to her gate, and when she boards, her boarding group has already gotten on. And so all the seats that she liked to take, those are already gone. She liked to sit towards the front of the plane because she liked to be one of the people that got off the plane first once they landed. And so she began looking for the first open row that she could sit in. And so she starts walking down the row and she finally gets to row 14. She's looking on her left and there's a totally open row, 3 open seats. And so like she always did on long flights, she took the window seat, seat 14A, because she could lean her head up against the side of the plane and sleep. And so after she buckled herself in and put her luggage underneath the seat in front of her, her, she remembered she had just drank that huge cup of coffee while she was going through security, and even though she didn't have to go to the bathroom right then, she expected to probably have to go a couple of times once they took off. And so, not wanting to disrupt the two people that were inevitably going to take the two seats next to her by constantly all flight long getting up and sneaking past them to go to the bathroom over and over again, Holly decides, you know what, I'll just move. I will sit in the aisle seat. It's not as good because I can't sleep, but at least this way I can get up and use the bathroom without disrupting the people I'm sitting near. And so she unbuckles herself, she reaches down, she grabs her bag from underneath the chair in front of her, she stands up and she moves 2 seats over to the aisle seat of row 14. She sits down, she puts her seatbelt on, she puts her luggage under the seat in front of her there, and then as she's kind of getting herself situated, she sees someone has stopped right outside of row 14. And so she turns, and looking down at her is the smiling face of Jennifer Reardon. And she says, hi, is anybody sitting next to you? Can I sit next to you? And Holly says, absolutely. And Jennifer sneaks past her and sits in the window seat. So that's going to do it, guys. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please ask the like button to hold your easily startled cat. And then once they're doing that, press the test button on your smoke detector. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 2 or 3 video uploads. We are now selling merchandise like flannels and hats and mugs and sweatshirts and all sorts of stuff. If you're interested, go to shopmrballen.com. If you want to learn about upcoming deals and promotions for our merchandise, go to our shop's Instagram page. The username is shopmrballen. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's johnballen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is Mrballen. We also have a second YouTube channel called Mrballen Shorts where we post random short videos and lost episodes. We also have a Facebook page called Mrballen where we post condensed versions of the long episodes you see on YouTube. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called Mrballen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.